Here's the news read by Sergei Rudy. First, the headlines. The Soviet Union launched a new spaceship satellite weighing about 5 tons and carrying several animal passengers. Radio and television transmitters report conditions in the rocket to help study flight safety and the possibility of re-entry. The American spy trial ended in Moscow today. The U2-Powers, U2-Powers, brought down in Soviet territory on May the 1st, was sentenced to 10 years loss of liberty, the first 3 to be spent in prison. The United Nations headquarters announces a 4th meeting of the Security Council on Sunday to discuss the Congo. Prime Minister Lumumba insists that all non-African troops leave his country. Otherwise, he said, orders throughout the Congo cannot be restored. Those are the headlines. Here now are the details. The Soviet Union today launched the world's second spaceship satellite. Weighing about 5 tons without the final stage of the carrier rocket, it circles the Earth once about every 19½ seconds. Several animals are on board, including 2 dogs. The chief task of this latest Soviet experiment is to continue studies on conditions for life in a rocket, flight safety, and re-entry. The ship sails an average of about 200 miles above the Earth. A 19.995 megacycle transmitter telemeters information back to Earth, while a special television system shows the behavior of the animal passengers during their flight. The Soviet Union is the only country so far that has succeeded in sending animals into space on satellites. The first reports received by radio and television indicate that all the instruments are working normally. The pressure and temperature in the passenger cabin and the air and humidity are under control. The temperature is about 68 degrees and the pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. The animals were comfortable throughout the launching and flight till orbit was reached. On orbit, they are weightless but behaving normally and eating food prepared for them. The American spy trial ended in Moscow today. U2-Powers, the pilot brought down in the U2 incident on May the 1st, was sentenced to 10 years loss of liberty, the first 3 years in prison. The court mentioned, when pronouncing the sentence, that it has been established that the espionage flight was carefully prepared long before it took place. It stressed that this was a severe crime against the Soviet Union. Prosecutor Roman Rudenko said in his speech this morning that Powers' testimony revealed that the American government and President Eisenhower knew about and sanctioned the aggressive spy flights over Soviet territory arranged by the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Rudenko noted that Powers personally had carried out criminal assignments directly imperiling universal peace and capable of plunging humanity into horrible disaster. The prosecution asked for a 15-year sentence. The defense attorney, Mikhail Grinyov, drew the court's attention to the sum total of the circumstances of the case, which he believes should inspire a just sentence. He said the court must take into consideration the fact that Powers gave true and sincere testimony. Mr. Grinyov pointed out in conclusion that Soviet justice was never activated by severity or vengeance when passing sentence. The Soviet Union, he said, is stronger and mightier than ever before, and no provocators can intimidate it. I therefore ask that Powers' sentence be less severe than that requested by the prosecution. In his final plea, U2-Powers admitted that he had committed a most serious crime and asked that consideration be given his admission and repentance. The United Nations headquarters announces that the 4th meeting of the Security Council on the situation in the Congo will take place Sunday. The Congo asked for this session in view of sabotage of Security Council decisions by United Nations officials. Prime Minister Lumumba insisted at a news conference today that all non-African troops in the United Nations forces be withdrawn from his country. Otherwise, he said, orders throughout the Congo could not be restored. He criticized the Canadian soldiers for provoking the incident at the Leopoldville airport. Mr. Lumumba also condemned attempts by Secretary General Hammarskjöld to distort the facts of the case in order to mislead public opinion on the eve of the Security Council meeting. At the Leopoldville airport, meanwhile, the United Nations forces are digging in to keep the Congolese out. The United Press International Agency reports that the foreign soldiers have been ordered to fire in case of need. The conflict between the Congolese government and the United Nations Command was aggravated yesterday when Swedish troops at the airport provoked clashes with the Congolese. And that's the end of the news, broadcast to you from Radio Moscow. We now present a special weekly program arranged for the Vancouver Broadcasting Associates Limited, Canada. You will hear an interview granted Radio Moscow by Mr. Connie Ziliakas, British MP and prominent member of the Labour Party. Mr. Ziliakas commented on the American spy trial here in Moscow.
Can sum up my opinion of the trial under three aspects. The first is the legal or technical aspect. Now, I'm not a lawyer myself, I'm only a politician, but I have some conception of how we work the law in England, and I also know, of course, that the conceptions of jurisprudence under Roman law on the continent are rather different, and that in many ways, Soviet law, for instance, is much closer to French law than it is to British or American law. But I did talk with a lot of jurists, including a British Queen's Counsel who was at the court trial, and of course I saw the whole thing. And I would say that the unanimous opinion of the jurists of many countries was that this trial was conducted with the most scrupulous fairness. And indeed, the British Queen's Counsel said they are leaning backwards. They've been leaning backwards to give the defendant every chance and to give him the benefit of every doubt. The stress laid on the defendant's upbringing and his background and his social conditions and all that was the sort of thing that is done in French law. It is not done nearly to the same extent in Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence. But it is, of course, a very human aspect of the law. And the net impression made was that the verdict was just and humane, that Powers fared rather better than he would have done, or than his equivalent would have done if the situation had been reversed, and the Americans had shot down a pilot engaged on the kind of mission that he was engaged on. So much for the legal aspect of it. The second point, of course, is that the real indictment, the people who were really arraigned, were the cold warriors in the United States and their accomplices in other countries. Because this trial did show up the sheer idiocy as well as the moral baseness and arrogance of this policy of constant aerial espionage along the shores, along the frontiers of the Soviet Union, let alone the sheer monstrosity of the claim made by the Secretary of State Harper and endorsed by President Eisenhower that the United States was entitled to violate international law by carrying out spy flights over the territory of the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union had refused to legalize such flights at President Eisenhower's suggestion. And, when the President said the other day that he thought that he would like to have a plebiscite among the peoples of the world as to which system they preferred, the Soviet or the American, I would like somebody to suggest, since the United States claims to be doing this thing for the sake of protecting its allies and defending them, although it's never asked them about it, whether he wouldn't like to have a plebiscite in, say, Norway and Britain and a few other countries concerned as to whether we really want to have the Americans doing these things and having bases in our territory. And so far as Britain is concerned, at any rate, I'm absolutely certain that the result would be to get rid of the American bases and put a stop to this kind of thing. The third point is the horrifying light that the trial cast on the characteristics and shortcomings of the I'm all right Jack civilization. The attitude which is particularly strong in the United States, but which exists in all of the Western countries, and is becoming a problem in my own country, in Britain, is this attitude expressed in the old English saying about each man for himself and the devil takes the hindmost. And so capitalism does base the whole of society on the private profit-making motive of the individual, and has hammered home the idea that if only every man does his best to better his own material conditions by some curious process, the greatest good of the greatest number will result. Well, that never made much sense, except from the point of view of the middle class. But in present-day conditions, this philosophy has produced the kind of monstrosity that we see in the case of Powers. Because the horrifying thing about this lad is that he is typical. I'm half American myself, and I know the States pretty well. I'm a graduate of Yale University and so on. And this is a typical GI of a pretty good type of cat. A man who starts in very humble circumstances in a little town in Kentucky, working class parents, a miner who lost his job in unemployment. The boy himself tried to find his way out of unemployment by going into the Air Force. He couldn't find any other job that would give him something like security. And then step by step, and without ever giving a thought to the matter, without the slightest sense of social responsibility or addressing his mind to any possible international consequences, a moral condition, he tranquilly accepts contracts which thrust him right into this adventure that has ended with the shooting down of the plane at Sverdlovsk. And he never thought what he was doing. I certainly knew, of course, that what he was doing was hostile to the Soviet Union, that he was engaged in spying, but he'd never stopped to think out what all that meant or what its possible circumstances might be. He was concerned solely with the question of earning enough money to invest in having a garage of his own, and so entering the propertied classes in a small way. And when he was asked, this to me was one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, when he was asked, well, did it never occur to you what might be the consequences to world peace of your undertaking this flight on the eve of the summit conference? He said, with a note of stifled bitterness and despair in his voice, he said, my chief thought of that before they gave me such orders. And I thought it was sincere. I'm sure that was a cry of the heart. The boy had begun to think, at least. And his case is typical. And this is the really terrifying thing about the civilization of ours. If we do destroy ourselves with our gadgets, it will not be, I think, because anyone is wicked and mad enough deliberately to want a world war, but because the capitalist powers have become so dependent on war preparations to stave off unemployment in our private enterprise system, and because of such enormous vested interest in these war preparations, and because the Cold War is the anti-socialist opium of the people, that they cannot make peace, and they have to keep up this atmosphere of hatred and fear. But I think this trial will strike a mighty blow against all this, and will help to open the eyes of hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the West. And certainly, so far as Britain is concerned, I'm quite sure it will vastly strengthen the already powerful movement in our country for getting rid of the American bases, turning our back on the nuclear deterrence strategy, and refusing to be committed any longer to war by allies who will not come to terms with us on how to make peace with the Soviet Union.
That was a recorded statement made for Radio Moscow by Mr. Congo, British MP and prominent member of the Labour Party. This program was arranged for the Vancouver Broadcasting Associates Limited, Canada. You are tuned to Radio Moscow.